Hi again. Last time we looked at 4 steps to approaching a poem that we'd never read before. And we said that a lot of people get very nervous and anxious when dealing with new poetry because they don't really have a method for how to approach it. So that's what we're doing. We're coming up with a method to start digging into a poem, to dive into it so that we are successful in interacting with the poem. If you'll recall, last time we talked about the 4 steps of approaching a poem. You read it to yourself at least twice, silently, just reading it in your head. Then you need to hear the poem. So if you can find a version of the author reading the poem, that's always ideal, or perhaps a professional reading it, or just a friend reading it, or you can read it out loud to yourself or to a group of friends. Then you need to do some of the nitty-gritty work. You need to go in and define all the words that are not 100% clear. And I do mean that are not 100% clear. If you're sitting there going, yeah, I have a pretty good idea of what that means, that is not good enough in poetry. Every word counts. You need to make sure you understand the meaning and the connotation of every single word. So that means we're going to look up different words because we're different people with different backgrounds in learning English, in reading, and so on. So you're going to look up different words, different numbers of words. That's all okay. But you do need to spend the time to define the words you don't understand. And then you're ready to dive in. And that's what this presentation is about. It's about diving in. We want to dive into, if I can make a metaphor, we want to dive into the poetry pool smoothly. And as any swimmer or diver will tell you, a dive takes practice and method. You don't just throw yourself into the pool and land on your belly and wonder why it hurts. You have to prepare. You have to know what you're doing so that you make a nice, smooth, clean, safe dive into the pool. I want to talk to you about a method I've been using for a few years now called SOAPSTone. Now, SOAPSTone, just very coincidentally, is a type of stone, and it's often used by the Inuit people of northern North America to make carvings. You have a couple little examples here. And the only similarity I want to point out here, the only metaphorical similarity, is that to make a carving takes method and patience. And it's the same when you're approaching a poem. You need some method and you need some patience to get it right. And you might not get it right the first couple of times, but with practice you will get better. So, SOAPSTone, we're not going to talk about the stone anymore, but we're going to talk about this method, is an acronym. And SOAPSTone stands for subject, occasion, audience, purpose, speaker, and the tone, the author's attitude, or what it might, to the author's attitude to what he or she is writing about, or what it might sound like if the author were reading it aloud to us. Okay, if we can cover these basics, then we've got a good start to understanding a poem. Now we have a basis and a method for understanding how we're going to dive into that poetry pool. So let's take a look at each of these elements a little more closely. First of all, what's the subject of the poem? If you just had to say in a word or a phrase, literally just a word or a phrase, what is the poem about? Well, if I asked you what's the subject of In Flanders Fields, you would say, well, it's about war, it's about fighting a good battle, of not letting the dead die in vain. In a couple short phrases or words, that's what this poem is about. War might be just a little too general. It's a bit more specific than just war. It's about fighting a good fight and fighting for a just cause. Now, occasion is sort of the setting of the poem. If you want to think back to stories and plays, where and when is the poem happening? Not every poem has an exact occasion, but a lot of poems do. It may be a real occasion or it may be an imagined occasion. So what was the occasion in Flanders Fields? Well, it's quite clear. It's a battlefield in Flanders in southern Belgium after a battle during World War I. The poet sets that out very nicely for us. In Flanders Fields, the poppies grow. All right in the first line, we get the occasion. And it becomes quite clear as the poem goes on that there's been a major battle just taken place there. So that's the where and the when, the occasion. Another key element to consider is the audience. Who is this poem written for? Now, there may be an internal audience, someone that the poem is speaking to directly within the poem. But there could also be an external audience that goes outside the poem. And that external audience may be quite specific, or it could be quite general. It is important to ask yourself who the poem is written for, though. It's really key in figuring out what's going on in the poem. So there is an internal audience in Flanders Fields. The person who's speaking is addressing young men back in the British Empire who are wondering if they should enlist and go fight in France and Belgium. So this poem was written originally to encourage young men to go and enlist in war and to continue the fight for the British Empire in World War I. But there's also an external audience. There's an audience kind of outside the poem. It's not only for young men who might be thinking of enlisting, but it's for a much broader, wider audience. Really, anyone who's been affected by war will find some meaning in this poem. I think almost anybody could read this poem and be affected by it. So while there's a specific internal audience, the external audience in this particular case happens to be a lot more general. And really, one of the key things we need to figure out in any poem is what is its purpose? Why did the author write the poem? And what is the point that she or he wants to convey and get across? So what is the purpose of In Flanders Fields? Well, a lot of people assume it's an anti-war poem, but in fact, when McCrae wrote it in, I think it was 1916, he really, as we said before, was urging young men to enlist in the British Empire forces so that those men who had died in Flanders Fields would not have died in vain, that their deaths would have meant something. So he's really encouraging people and exhorting people to continue the fight against the enemy. So it has perhaps a different meaning today, but when McCrae wrote it, that was his original purpose. One other thing to consider is the speaker. Who is speaking in the poem? Is there an obvious speaker, or is there a sort of a general undefined speaker? We can't always, if there isn't a specific speaker in the poem, we can't always assume it's the author. In fact, the IB actively discourages us from thinking this. They really don't like to hear the author thinks, the author thinks. It might not be what the author thinks. Sometimes authors create a speaker who thinks something quite differently from what the author's opinions are. But it's quite clear that in Frost's poem, our speaker is a dead soldier. He's just been recently killed, and so he's there, the spirit of this dead soldier, to exhort and encourage young men in the British Empire to enroll in the army and to continue fighting against the enemy. Not every poem will have a specific speaker, but it is something to consider. And again, it's really important not to assume that the author is the speaker if there's not an obvious speaker. Finally, you want to consider what the tone is, and this is perhaps the most challenging part of the SOAPSTone acronym. So the tone is the whole last part of the acronym. I like to think of it as, how does the poem sound when it's read aloud? Okay? During that reading aloud process, I mean, In Flanders Fields is not a poem you would read like, in Flanders Fields the poppies grow, da da da. No, it's not a joyful, light, frivolous poem. Okay? So ideally, you want to get 3 adjectives that would describe the poem. Okay? Tone words need to be adjectives because they're describing a poem, a thing, a noun. But I do want to warn you again from using bland adjectives such as happy and sad and mad. Okay, yes, the speaker is sad, but that's so vague and imprecise that it doesn't really tell me anything. You have to do better than sad. So, in Flanders Fields, we could say that the tone is somber. It's solemn. There's a sense of occasion about this, a sense of formality. It's very serious. So I have 3 words, all coincidentally starting with S, that might describe the tone of this poem. I'm sure you can think of a couple others that don't involve sad, but those would probably do for the time being. Now, I just want to make a couple important points about SOAPSTone in general. Usually, most times, the most important element of any poem is the purpose, okay? It's why the author sat down and wrote this poem. So that's one of the main things you need to figure out. But you may need to do a bit of detective work around it before you come to the purpose. Now, not every poem has a clear occasion or a clear speaker and audience. It depends on the poem. You'll find some poems where the soapstone is perfectly clear. You'll find other poems where the speaker's not clear, maybe the occasion isn't completely clear. That's okay, that's just how it works. However, almost every poem I have ever read will have a clear subject, a specific tone, and a very well-defined purpose. Okay, those 3 are pretty non-negotiable. So don't worry if you get to a poem later on where you're like, I don't really see an occasion happening. That's entirely possible. If you get to a poem and you say, I don't see a tone, then you have a problem. Then you need to go back and take a closer look at some of the diction in that poem and take a closer look at what's going on. I would like you now to write a paragraph about the poem In Flanders Fields by, not by Robert Frost, by McCrae, typo there. And I would like you to use SOAPSTone. So, please arrange. You want to think about how you're going to organize your paragraph, okay? You have a lot of information to fit in. Please do not try to fit everything into 3 sentences. It's a paragraph, okay? Don't have to write 3 huge, gigantic sentences. This is complex information. Sometimes you need to break it down into smaller bits. So aim for concise sentences. Now, you don't want to just go through it SOAPStone, okay? That's not going to work. Speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, subject, tone. That's not going to work. That's not going to make a well-organized paragraph if you just handle it in the way it's presented. The reason that it's presented as speaker, occasion, audience is it makes a neat little acronym. That's the only reason it's worded that way. When you're organizing a paragraph about SOAPSTone, you probably want to start quite general. Like maybe what's the subject, who's the speaker, the occasion, maybe the audience. Start with the most general item, and that's probably going to be the subject. This poem is about, In Flanders Fields, is a poem about fill in the gap. And you probably want to end with the most important elements, which are probably tone and purpose. You should probably end with purpose as your most important element. It's what the poem is all about. So when you're organizing your paragraph that you're going to write now on In Flanders Fields, start general, work to the very specific and the very important, and do your best. Please write these in a Google Doc and then be prepared to share them with me. All right, thanks for listening.